Hello, and welcome to another exciting special edition of the Scottish Liberty Podcast with me, Antony Sammeroff, and my co-host,
Tom Laird.
Today we have a very special guest, Catriona Knapman, and she's doing a show at the Fringe this year called Out on the World. Hi Catriona, and welcome to the show.
Hi Anthony, nice to see you. Thanks for having me.
It's a real pleasure to have you. So we met at a preview or something like that a few nights ago, and you were telling me a little bit about your show, and I heard some of your poetry as well, and I was really fascinated about your story of, what you've done. So why don't you introduce our audience to yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do and your history and how you came to be making that into a show.
Yeah, absolutely. So my show, as you said, give you a little snippet of it. The show's called Out in the World, and it's a journey through 3 countries where I've lived and worked as a human rights worker. So we visit Nicaragua, Egypt and Burma. So they're all places I lived and worked. I've actually lived in 8 countries over the past 10 years. So often in this job you work a lot of contracts, so you end up moving around a lot. So the show tries to show a little bit the other side of what's happening in the news. So not just the stories of angry men waving placards or, stories of sort of politics and everything like that. So that's part of it, but also trying to look at sort of everyday stories of little snippets of everyday life of those countries as well. So it's often what you see when you live and work in a place, and it's not what you see in the media or when you go and just visit as a tourist. So trying to capture a bit more of those sort of everyday stories.
Oh, really wonderful. And what mediums do you use? Is it poetry and storytelling, or are there other elements to it?
Yeah, I've also got sort of a photo collection as well. So it's sort of like trying to show little snapshots. So often each poem often comes with a photo, and then so a little snapshot through a photo, and then through a poem, and then a little story. So it sort of interacts between those 3 elements. And I've also got some music from each of the countries to use as transitions between each
cool.
each part of the set. Yeah.
So how did you get into being a human rights worker?
Yeah, it's a long story of rebellion against becoming a lawyer.
Right.
Yeah. No, I studied law and French at Edinburgh Uni actually, and I was really interested in sort of the human side of law. I was interested in things like criminal law and family law and human rights aspects, but I didn't really have any clue how to work in human rights. So I began to sort of start doing volunteer work and that sort of thing, and then I did volunteer work even up until I'd been working for a few years. I was doing it in the evenings and beside my main job. So I think a lot of volunteering was how it began. And then I got an opportunity. My first job was with the European Court in Luxembourg.
Right.
As a stagiaire, and then they took me on a short-term contract as well. And alongside that, I was volunteering at Amnesty in Luxembourg. And then the Luxembourg government took me on a traineeship program that they had for young people. So that's what took me to Nicaragua. So I worked for 2 years for the Luxembourg government in Nicaragua. Yeah, and then from then I've sort of managed to pick up different contracts. I went back to do a master's and then begun working more focusedly on land right issues. And for the past 4 or 5 years I've been working on land rights with a lot of also focus on women's rights and gender rights as well.
Okay. And women's rights to land.
Yeah, women's rights to land is my particular focus I've been working on for the past few years. Yeah.
And is there an imbalance in many countries that you've visited in terms of what rights people have to land according to their gender?
Yes, yeah, I would say absolutely. Yeah. Where I work most on this is in Myanmar or Burma. And there access to land is very much defined by your gender, and that's also the case. I've done a lot of work in sub-Saharan Africa as well, and that's also the case there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is that codified in these countries? Is that codified in law, or is it traditional? I mean, is there anything, for example, if I'm an elder of a tribe or I'm just a patriarch of a family, is there anything in law that would prevent me from passing on my land to my female issue, or is it just a traditional thing?
So there's like a sort of gap, but there's sort of 2 levels of it. So there's the statutory law or the national law, and then there's customary systems and customary practice. And very often, most of sub-Saharan Africa in the statutory law, There's provisions for gender equality in decision making around land, sometimes for land specifically, but sometimes for decision making more broadly within the country. But then at the customary level, the customary practice level, it's that men are the ones who look after land, and that's where the discrimination is more likely to happen.
Okay.
In Burma, it's quite similar. There's in Burma, there's not been a whole lot of legislation on land because the country's been under military control for so long. A lot of there's a lot of legislation on land, but often it dates back from the colonial period,
right.
or they're more like laws relating to land confiscations.
Right.
So a lot of recent laws have been created, but they don't really have a lot of gender equality provisions in them. The most recent piece of law on Burma is called the National Land Use Policy. So it's an umbrella policy which covers land in the country. It does have gender equality provisions in it, but it's not really, it was only properly, when was it published? I think in March this year.
Okay.
So it's quite new, and it's not really been properly implemented, and it was created by the previous government, so the transition government. In Burma, and then of course Aung San Suu Kyi's party was elected in November last year, so it's unclear whether her party is going to take that piece of law over and use it, or whether they're going to create their own policy. So there's a lot of transition happening in Myanmar right now, so it's quite unclear whether what's exactly going to happen there. But there again, it's women often don't have access to their land, or women. I'll give you a better example. There's been a 2012 statute in Myanmar which allows farmers to register user rights on their land.
Okay.
The government in Myanmar still owns all the land in the country, but farmers for the first time since 2012 can have user rights, which allows them to do things like mortgage their land and sell it and get credit for their land.
But they can't actually own land per se.
No, there's not an ownership right, it's a user right.
Right.
So this is the first time something like this has existed in the country. So that's a new provision that's happened. It only exists on farmland. There's lots of different categories of land in Myanmar, so it only exists for land categorised as farmland. It's quite complicated, but largely men have been registered as the owners under this statute. So that means women, although traditionally they use the land and they're farming that land, they're not getting the piece of paper with their name on it necessarily for that piece of land, because the man is considered the head of the household according to tradition and practice. Yeah.
So what little I know about land rights the world over is that you find problems in countries where there aren't land rights because people are less likely to invest in the land and develop the land if it can be taken away in any time by the government or the military or some corporation lobbies. Like, I know that, say, charities have a very difficult time, environmental charities, just going and buying up the rainforest, because even if they buy the rainforest, those property rights will not necessarily be respected by the government, who can then give logging rights to that land to a logging company. So it's a lack of private property rights, a lack of land rights. And what would you say is going wrong in land rights in the countries that you've worked with, and what would help improve that situation? I know that's like a huge question.
It's a big question. There's also your, I don't know, the position that you come at that from is a sort of privatisation position, which wouldn't necessarily
be the one that you...
I'm not sure exactly where I stand on that, but I think a lot of organisations in, for example, Myanmar wouldn't agree with that position. They would they would see land as primarily being something that was cultural and a social entity before it was a private entity.
So
do you mean the NGOs themselves see it that way?
Well, I suppose, like, especially local NGOs. I wouldn't necessarily say international NGOs. I think often, NGOs ultimately are coming at things often with their own political or own politics, not necessarily in party politics, but in terms of where they stand on the political spectrum. So I think it depends often what your vision is, how you see something like that. So, it's an important question, though. It's a really big part of what land rights stand for. Yeah.
I think when I say private property, I might mean something slightly different from what you might think.
Maybe,
which might just be that anyone can, like, as you say, own their own land individuals. I don't mean privatization in terms of necessarily going to corporations or what we understand in this country, at least by privatization, is usually the government will sell some assets that were previously held by the government to a company and then forbid any other companies from competing with that company. Something like what we saw in the energy industry when that was privatized. It was handed over to a few companies and they kind of put a wall around it to make it very difficult for anyone else to create energy. Simply what I mean by sort of private property rights is the same way that I might be able to buy this flat from my landlord and from our political point of view, we believe in something called homesteading, which is if you mix your labour with the land, if you're the farmer and you cultivate that land in a way, well, that's how you ought to be able to claim ownership for that land because you mixed the labour from the land. When we had in this country things like the Highland clearances and things like that were conducted by aristocrats against probably the farmers who'd properly homesteaded the land and should have traditionally been entitled to land rights. Do you think that's more congruent with your point of view, or do you take a different position on that?
I think that position is largely how a lot of Myanmar farmers would see the situation. I mean, I think from them, largely, I know that Myanmar was under military control for a very long time, but actually in terms of what the farmers themselves could do, they weren't necessarily restricted in terms of how they could use land. And these new land laws that have come in 2012 have much more restricted their ability to access land because they have to have this farm, and it has become more controlled in a way, which is sort of the inverse of what you would think would be happening, which is quite interesting.
Do you think these new controls are positive in some way, or do you think they're creating problems?
No, I think they do have I think any change comes with fallout for both sides. I think there is value to you know, when I say cadastral maps, you know, like the land registry in Scotland. In Myanmar, the cadastral maps date from 1940, around 1936, 1940. So there haven't really been any proper planning and surveys done of the land in Myanmar and who owns it since really the British were in control of the country. So I think in terms of starting to map out ownership and that sort of thing and understanding who owns what and how land is being used, I think it's helpful in trying to understand who. It starts to get a grasp of who's using what and how and what that's being used for. So then you can get a proper picture of what's being used in the country, what resources are being used, who's planting what, that sort of thing, which I think is at the moment is not fully being captured because of the way the land was being managed previously. So I think in that sense it's positive. I guess I have mixed feelings about individual ownership rights. I think in some senses they're positive. They give people the opportunity to choose how they use their land and whether they want to buy it or sell it or buy more land and all the rest of all that sort of accompanying rights that come with it. I think that's positive. It allows farmers to gain credit on their land. At the moment that isn't working very well in Myanmar, but if that was possible, I think that would be a positive thing. But I think it does also create a culture, a very individualistic culture, and that's not what culturally is sort of in the surrounding ambient in Myanmar. It's much more a communal society, and that's the way the mindset's set up. So I think that's something to consider.
Would they? I know from my own experience, well, not my only experience, but experience in sort of African societies and tribal societies where, we here in the West to a certain degree value individualism, whereas in a tribal society, they're suspicious of that because it's not congruent with tribal living. You know, we're all the one tribe, and in order to survive as a tribe, we can't allow. Actually, individuality is a bit dangerous in that context. Would you say maybe in Myanmar they have the same sort of concept of that, or is it slightly different?
It's a little bit different. I don't think there's really. I think you can't say the word tribe to apply to Myanmar. I think maybe ethnic. There's the strong ethnic groups, and then I think there's villages and village practices, and I think in order to work together with other people in your village, you have to have a communal mindset in order to be able to, resolve disputes amicably and all that sort of thing, and work out how you operate together. And I think there's more of a sense of that sort of feeling. So I think often I don't know. I'm a little bit wary of any. I would also be very wary of a sort of large, sort of massively applied system which encourage sort of customary practice or communal practice as well. I think often
from a central planning point of view.
I think a lot of these things, a lot of large scale planning like that doesn't always consider the individual cases and how people interact with that. So I think they often both have the tendency to cause problems on the ground.
I mean, two good examples of that would probably be China with the Great Leap Forward, and maybe sort of Pol Pot in Cambodia, where they tried to centrally plan an agrarian economy, and it just was a complete disaster.
It didn't work.
I heard a stat like in the Soviet Union there was about 5 or 6% of land that was actually allowed to be privately owned. I don't know if that's the word you'd use for it in a communist system, but that land actually produced 25% of the agricultural produce. So, which is amazing, but also it makes me think, wow, you said here's a country here that has no privately owned, again, I don't know if that's the word you'd like to use, but no land that isn't owned by the government, and I don't know what the implications of that are for the development of that country, and maybe you can elucidate.
Yeah, I mean,
what's the staple diet for a start? I mean, what are they farming mainly?
It depends on the part of the country. There's actually quite a large range of crops, sort of going from orchard type crops like betel, betel nut, like the stimulant they use in Pakistan, the red nut that they chew. They use that in Myanmar a lot, so that's a big product. And cashew, sort of also in trees. But then grow a lot of fruits and vegetables as well in certain parts of the country, like chilies, watermelons, pomelo, if you know what that is. It's like a big grapefruit. And then also a lot of rice. Rice would be the number one. And then a lot of beans in certain parts of the country. And
are they grown commercially? Is it full scale, or is it just generally small?
I mean, there tend to be small plots. But they are grown for they're largely grown as cash crops. They're not really grown as subsistence.
Right.
I mean, some would be used for subsistence, but a lot of people sell their products then. Yeah. But usually they sell them onto local brokers at a local market, or they sell them on a sort of smaller scale locally, and then maybe it gets used nationally more than anything. I don't think a large amount of it's sold for export. Yeah. So it's sort of, I think also because it's not a country that's had a lot of international dealing up until now, so
it's been pretty much closed off.
And I work on a rubber project as well in one area, so that's also smallholder rubber farming.
How did rubber get? I mean, that's not. Is it? It's
no,
not
that
native?
was centrally planned. They decided because rubber, I think about 10 years ago or so, rubber was doing really well in the international market, so the government decided to implement rubber plantations in certain parts of the country. But now, of course, rubber price is a lot lower. So it takes about 7 years for rubber to mature. So before you actually get the benefit from the crop, then you often the price it's a bit of a tricky crop.
Quite a risk. It's quite a risk,
it's a big crop.
And to kind of like put your to invest in that kind of 7-year year plan, that's quite risky, and it kind of reminds me of what Keynes, the economist, believed about like private investment, where the market's too unpredictable for private investment, because if you're going to build this steel mill that's going to be served, you can't predict 20, 30 years in the future, so the government's going to have to invest in that. And the government in this case didn't invest in a 7-year plan for rubber. Also, obviously, Venezuela has been heavily dependent on oil, and now that oil prices have plummeted, it's been a real humanitarian disaster over there, which is really sad. Yeah, but I digress.
No, but I think it's important. It's important to understand, I think, how much sort of small farmers like that invest in one product because they think the market is doing well, and then if the market price drops due to, for example, I used to work in Nicaragua, and there the coffee farming, when the coffee markets crashed, there was a huge impact for the small holding farmers, especially sort of ones who didn't have land, who were labourers on farms. They were severely hit by crashes in the international market, and it was to do with schemes in other countries, like say in Africa, to grow more coffee. So there was more supply in the market, so Nicaraguan coffee, the demand for Nicaraguan coffee went down, and then that has an impact on families actually. Do you know, like individual small holding farmers yes, because they're the ones who are trading in that. They usually only have one commodity that they're trading in, and that makes them very vulnerable to changes in the markets. Yeah.
Can I just ask you, can I get back to the show just for a second? You've been doing the show how long now?
This will be my 6th day today.
Okay,
yeah.
and what's the audience reaction? First of all, what's the demographic? Is it random, or is there any particular demographic to the audience?
I think it's I've had quite a range of people in. I've had sort of old people, young people, sort of everyone in between. So I'd say I've had quite a good range of different people.
And what's the reaction been so far?
I've had really positive feedback actually from people who have come to see it. I've had sort of one girl told me she made her cry, I think in a nice way. And other people who have just been really interested in finding out things about, I suppose, aspects of these countries that you don't always hear about, or sort of in the Egyptian part of the show, for example, I talk a bit about how I found the Egyptians so engaging and so funny when I lived with them, and when you see them on the news, they're always waving placards and looking very angry. And I think it's just sort of, I think people kind of enjoy hearing those stories. And hearing the poems that I use are often quite visual, so there's a lot of different images from those countries as well. So I try and give a sort of flavour of place and time and all those.
Do you think the lousy weather is helping the audience figures at all?
I don't know if it's helping actually, because people are not necessarily wanting to come out. But that was my pitch yesterday when I was flying. Get out of the rain.
So would you like to share one of your poems with us now?
Yeah, of course. I'm not sure where I should share from, or what would be a good theme. I'm just trying to rethink.
Anything you like.
So we've got Nicaragua, Egypt, and Burma.
I'll go for a Burmese one.
Burmese one, yeah. So, okay, I'll do the first one maybe I'll do. I'm trying to think. I've got one that's about Myanmar when I first arrived there, and that's it talks a bit about the changes in the country, a little bit of the unrest at that time. And I've got another one about changing Yangon, which is more about like Yangon physically changing with the...
It sounds like, it seemed like your face lightened
with
up.
the Yangon.
Your face lit up when you mentioned that one.
The changing Yangon.
Yeah, you looked at it.
We'll do that one then, yeah. So maybe I'll give you a little bit of a background to it beforehand.
Sure.
So Myanmar in the news, as you know, the politics is changing in Myanmar at the moment, but the sort of most physical evidence you see of that is in the city of Yangon and in a few other sort of more developed parts of the country, where you see new shopping malls appearing all of a sudden. You also see a lot of new international restaurants. For example, I think there's now two or three KFCs in Myanmar. Didn't used to be any of those. There's no Starbucks or McDonald's yet. I think there's 5 or 6 Mexican restaurants now in
Mexican
Myanmar.
Restaurants in Myanmar, okay.
Yeah. There's also, I think, 2 bars with mixologists, as far as I can tell. Yeah, so Myanmar has got its own mixologists, but there's still only about 5 or 6 ambulances to service this city of 5 million people. So you often see the changes in these sort of very commercial type.
Happening on the sort of high street consumer level.
Exactly. But the changes are not necessarily happening in terms of the really sort of fundamental infrastructure that's needed.
Right.
If only there was some way of getting the same commercial acumen into the ambulances and the infrastructure.
I think we've heard that, in Africa in some places you have big highways going towards wherever the natural resources are, and plastic surgeries for rich people, but no more basic infrastructure.
The Chinese in Africa, for example, built enough. The British did the same thing. We built enough roads and railways to get the copper out. And that's
everything else has to wait.
Yeah.
So anyway, this next poem was about a little bit about that, but also about the government's response to the sort of huge influx and increase of traffic in the city. Has been to build some flyovers, and these flyovers take about a year to construct, to make the traffic much worse in the process of construction. But when they were finished, I actually really loved these flyovers, because you get lifted from the sort of down at the street level all the time to suddenly going upwards, and you start seeing different parts of the city that you wouldn't have seen before. So that was what inspired the poem. Yeah.
Super.
Will I do it to you or to the camera, or both?
Please do it to our audience.
Do it to our audience.
And we'll listen intently.
Okay, great. They tell us development is a straight line of progress, horizontal and determined towards better days. Really, the changes have been in the vertical axis, profits and losses, bridges and shopping malls, health records and mobile phone users, the new peaks of Yangon. There used to be only 2-story buildings, then a rush of 8-floor condominiums, a regulation that a building with 9 floors must contain an elevator. Then the new rise of shopping malls. The latest is 23 stories, constructed slowly. Each year we crane our necks to mark its progress. And the 6 new flyovers, which take us from the straight line of our journey to course suddenly upwards. The taxi speeding past curtains, pot plants, a few shirts on a hanger, out to dry, a glimpse of gold, Schwedagon, then descending to street level, traffic jams, stoplights, the bare feet of monks.
Lovely, thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thoroughly enjoyed that one.
So, we've heard quite a lot about Myanmar because that's where you are just now. Perhaps you could tell us each a little bit of your experiences in Egypt and Nicaragua, and maybe along the way we'll hear a couple more of your poems.
Yeah, that sounds fine. So where will we start? We go to Nicaragua.
Nicaragua's a good one.
Let's travel to Nicaragua. Yeah. In Nicaragua, I lived in a small town called Esteli, which is in the northern mountains of the country. And I worked with coffee farmers in the 5 northern departments. So I spent a lot of time on very bumpy buses and sometimes on horseback getting to visit the farmers. And the idea of the project there, it was with the Luxembourg government I was working, and we worked to try and diversify those farmers' income who had been so reliant on coffee. The idea was to diversify the income largely through developing a concept called rural community tourism, which is about bringing tourists to communities so that they can offer sort of basic accommodation services, tour guide services, see local attractions, and also have the experience, I suppose, of visiting and living with a farmer and start getting to see sort of daily things like milking cows and making tortillas and that sort of thing. Yeah.
What was Luxembourg's interest in all this?
Luxembourg has Luxembourg is actually one of the countries that gives the biggest amount of its sort of percentage of its GDP to development.
All right.
Yeah, it gives about 1%, or it was giving 1% when I worked there. It might be I'm not entirely sure the figures now. That was about almost 10 years ago
1%.
now.
1%. So is that quite? Is that high then?
Yeah, because the UK. Well, I'm not sure what the UK gives now. I think it gives about 0.6 or 0.7, or that was the case a while ago when I was working in Luxembourg. I knew all these figures because Luxembourg is obviously very proud of the fact it gives such a high percentage of its quite rightly so, it gives a high percentage of its GDP to development, and often it focuses on other smallish countries like itself, and then also on francophone countries. So it works in a lot of francophone Africa, and then it also works in El Salvador and Nicaragua. So they're sort of target countries for it.
What's Luxembourg's GDP? Where did they go? What did they? I don't know. I've never actually eaten it. I don't think so.
Luxembourg makes a lot of money from banking, and it's also got a lot of EU investment.
That's what they're doing. They're salving their currency.
They've got Luxembourg used to be an agricultural economy. It was largely sort of farming and quite rural until like the late 80s, and then it started having quite favourable regulations for investment, and now it's got a huge number of banks are in Luxembourg, banks and law firms and the EU institutions that makes up Luxembourg.
Right, so it's putting its money in the collection plate at church on Sunday.
Yeah, I think it's actually, they're really strategic, very smart country in the way that they operate, I think. Yeah.
And is it true that the way that aid is given now is much more smart than in the past? Because I heard there were some bad incidents of people trying to put food in third world economies, creating gluts in the market, and putting local farmers out of business and things like that. Has there been a change in the way that aid's given and operates around the world?
I think the world of development is always going to be a complex one because there's so many different players at different levels. So you sort of start with your local NGOs very much at grassroots level, working with communities. Then you have INGOs or national NGOs, sort of national NGOs NGOs, then international NGOs operating in country, then international NGOs in their head offices in London, and then you've got people like national donors, then donors like the EU and sort of large international donors, UN, and then the World Bank and people like this. So there's a lot of many different players, all with different agendas.
Right.
So it's always extremely complex the way that aid is provided and the way it's given. And I mean, there's a lot of arguments now that at the moment aid is far too donor driven, because it often, because the money comes through the donors, then their agenda drives the way that a lot of things happen on the ground. A lot of people don't agree with that. It makes it sometimes a lot more difficult for small local NGOs to really act appropriately and get funding.
Right. And they're the ones, are they the ones that have the facts in the ground and know how to help people better? Or,
well, yeah, they're the ones who are connected
to
communities. Well, the knowledge is at different levels, and it depends on what knowledge you have. And often the best projects have a sort of combination of those players working together well in a sort of team-based type, arrangement. Because often you need someone who understands the donor system to get the funding channeled towards your work, and then you need someone maybe who understands the national system well to make sure it coordinates well and it's not overlapping with other projects, and then you need someone who understands good connections to a community and long-term investment in that community in order to be able to really work well together with them.
And what do you think about the direct giving charities that have actually become quite popular on the internet there, where the charity will just go to people in the poorest places of the world and just give them money?
I haven't heard of those. Have you got an example of one of those?
I know that there's. I'm very sorry to say I don't have a specific example, but I heard that there's websites that basically rate charitable giving according to how well, how much, what percentage of that money actually goes to helping people as opposed to administration, and that the direct giving charities were doing really well on these rating websites, and that they've become quite popular. So wow, I'm just you're so. I found this conversation so eligible. Educational.
Freudian slip there.
We always have a great laugh.
You are very eligible.
I know. Well, that's what the fans say. So, no, I've just found it so educational, and maybe you'll be able to look into that and get back to us and see if you've got any, from your well-informed opinion, if you've got any feedback on that, if you do get to look into it.
I have heard of these websites that rate, I suppose, I think they rate how much money goes towards actual projects and how much goes towards staff costs and admin costs and that kind of thing. Because, I mean, I think it's difficult though. I think charities do have, I mean, they are under a lot of pressure, a lot of charitable organisations, to raise funds to keep the system going. So they do need to put a percentage of their income into fundraising. I think the danger is when you have ones, I think around Darfur, there were quite a lot of NGOs that were basically just publicity machines, that they were raising money to raise awareness about Darfur. So they were having all these posters of, poor looking children from Darfur up on walls, and people had to give money, and then that money was going towards creating more posters, and that sort of thing is not very helpful.
We want to see people's standards of livings improving.
Exactly,
I mean, how do you feel about I've heard it said that in a lot of these countries, whether it be Africa, whether it be Asia, a lot of the local population say, and other commentators have said, look, people don't need aid, they need trade. They need to be able to trade their goods to the Western world. That's what would improve their standard of living, no end, rather than aid. Is there any truth in that? How do you see that? I mean, now that we're out, we've done the Brexit thing. I mean, one of the things with being part of Europe is we couldn't actually trade with these people properly because there's so many embargoes and tariffs. Whereas now, I think we have a perfect opportunity to trade with these people properly, buy their goods, buy their coffee directly, and and improve their standard of living. But I don't know how you were on the ground, so I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately, like, My job, I think my job, I'm only useful in my job if I understand that I'm trying to make myself out of business, if that makes sense. If I keep trying to self-perpetuate my presence in these places, or keep trying to self-perpetuate the idea that I'm important in this equation, then I think I'm not doing my job properly.
Yes, I'm a therapist, so I very much understand. If I do my job well, I'm making myself redundant.
Yeah, exactly. So you have to. I think you do have to have that mindset of like, don't need to be here forever, and how can I help people in these countries to be really making the best contribution that they can make. But at the same time, everything that you deal with in development, you tend to work on a sort of project basis, and you can focus in on that project. But then, of course, when you look at that project in the broader context, you're caught up in all these things to do with, when you look at gender, it's always to do with traditions, culture, law, all these sort of very hard embedded issues that are not going to be solved overnight. And then when you look at things like coffee farming and other things like that, you're embedded in the whole world of global trade. And that's, again, is something that can't be solved easily or quickly. But I do think ultimately, like, the world of aid is helpful to an extent, but I think real change, I think I also seen this in my own life. Change only really happens when you take control yourself of what your circumstances and what needs to be done to make your life better. And then I think aid is at its best when it's supporting someone to achieve that. When they're already feeling empowered and feeling able to make a change.
Wonderful.
So I think often the way that aid is sold in Scotland or in the West in general is this idea of, we're going in to save these people. I don't think that idea is helpful at all, and I don't think it creates a good environment.
Have you heard of the kind of one laptop per child kind of thing? No, this is weird. I don't know where that came from, but I'm sure I'd heard Dominic Frisby talking about it before. There was a scheme that they had in Africa where they decided, okay, we're going to give each child a laptop computer. And it was astoundingly successful. Without any training, without anything. These kids worked out how to use the laptops, and the kids who worked out how to use the laptops showed the other kids how to work the laptops, and they were going online, they were teaching themselves things, and it was like an incredible self-learning process that just burgeoned through just giving laptops to kids. So I mean that's I suppose an example of aid that would actually work and encourage that kind of self-development.
I think even you don't even need a laptop. I think mobile technology has been hugely influential in changing the way that people have access to information. And Myanmar, in Myanmar in 2012 when I arrived, a SIM card cost about $200 or $300.
Really?
In 2014, that changed to $1.50.
Wow!
And so now the whole, not the whole country, but a huge percentage of people now have access to mobile phone technology, which they didn't have before. And you see now, you now see people at market stalls, sitting with their phones. And Facebook has become enormously popular there. So a lot of people get a lot of information through Facebook news feeds.
Wonderful.
Farmers as well and things. They look up things on Facebook news
Something
feeds.
simple as like weather reports online can be incredibly helpful for farmers.
No, exactly. Or having access to crop prices, market prices, and that sort of thing. Which day is a good day to sell? Which is a good day to buy? That sort of thing can make a big difference. So I think things like that do empower people because they have access to knowledge and information through.
What was the most stark difference? I mean, did you go from Myanmar to Nicaragua? Or was it...
No, so the other way around. So I was in Nicaragua, then I was in Europe for a couple of years because I got quite sick actually when I was in Nicaragua with a lot of bacteria and things. I got a lot of parasites in my intestines. So I was in Europe for a little bit, and then after that I went to Egypt, and then I had a couple of months in Europe, but then I went on to Myanmar after Egypt. So
tell us a story from your experiences in Nicaragua, and then let's hear another one of your poems.
Okay, great. What will I tell you about Nicaragua? I'll tell you the thing that most impressed me about Nicaragua, and that was really its people. It's a country you've probably heard about through the revolution. In 1979, they overthrew their dictator, and then they turned into this then the Sandinista party took power.
Yeah.
And
Daniel
then
Ortega.
Daniel Ortega, yeah.
Is he back in
yeah,
now?
he
Okay,
came
that's
back.
incredible,
Yeah,
really.
so he was in power in the 1980s, and then they had a Contra war with the United States, which was really like a sort of satellite Soviet Cold War type war, and was also a war between two factions within Nicaragua. The country was sort of left quite poor and just exhausted, I think, by the end of it, because they'd had about 10 years of revolution and then 10 years of war, and then they didn't have very much fights left in them, I think. So peace was declared, and then in 1990 they had the first democratic elections.
I like the idea of peace being declared.
Peace was declared. People were just like, this is enough.
Enough
Time
of this
for
shit.
peace.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And then from then until 2006, the Liberal Party was in control of Nicaragua, so it had much more kind of pro-US, I suppose, pro-trade policies, that kind of thing.
So is that liberal as in more classically liberal, or is it neoliberal, or is it...
I'd say kind of... I don't know quite where liberal meets capitalism, that sort of line.
Okay, so a free market kind of approach to things,
yeah.
or right, okay.
They're kind of a bit more free market and a bit more. I mean, I suppose it's hard to equate them with something like the Conservatives or something like that. But I suppose if you think of the Sandinistas, they're very left wing, aren't they?
Yeah.
So I suppose the rhetoric of the Liberals is a little bit more right than that, but I wouldn't really say they're as far right as in the UK.
Right,
that kind of thing.
Right. So maybe classically liberal, or at least that's what they claim to be.
Yeah, and then 2006, Ortega came back, and he's been in power since then, and he's still, I think he's vying for another term now as well. Yeah, so he's been in power, I think.
Is he popular? Obviously, he was democratically elected, I take it.
So he's popular enough to be elected.
It's populist, I would say, not popular.
Okay. Who does he appeal to then?
He appeals to farmers, and he appeals to rural communities, and he appeals to the poor. His rhetoric is very much for that group of people. And I mean, Nicaragua is very much a country divided in two. You're either very much like the war, like those factions still exist to a certain extent. A lot of people are very Sandinista, and they tend and want and support the Sandinista party, and then the other half are much more liberal, and they support the Liberal Party. It's sort of.
And in terms of human rights, is it open? I mean, are people able to criticise the government openly in Nicaragua?
Fairly openly, but there have been. I mean, I worked in Amnesty for a while in London, and then there were quite a lot of cases of intimidation of people who were speaking out against certain things, and there was claims that there was a gang of thugs that were employed by the Sandinista party to give people a hard time who disagreed with government. It spoke out in certain ways, but I mean, I haven't been following that much recently, so I'm not sure how it is. But I'd say I wouldn't say it's fully free and fair, but I'm not entirely sure where it is. To be honest, either.
So you were impressed by the people in Nicaragua. And
I think because they have this whole story of revolution, and then often people you'd meet, they'd tell you, their stories of being. Often they were sent. A lot of my colleagues.
Are they very upbeat people? Would you think?
Yeah, they're funny. They have a lot of jokes, and they like to go out and dance, and they like to go and laugh, and they like to tell stories, and they tend to be quite big characters. But they often have, I suppose, quite difficult lives of trying to survive. And they've often a lot of colleagues I worked with, there was bigotry recruitment into the government army when the Contra War began in the 1980s. So a lot of people were, when they were 17 or 18, had to go into the hills and fight. So they all had these stories of fighting, or fighting in the Sandinista armies, or fight, just sort of having these, like one guy I worked with, I always remember he ate his food so fast, he'd eat his food like this, and it was from that time when he had to eat his food really, really quickly. During the war. I
can totally relate to that. I was in the army, and after I came out of the army, my wife used to say to me, "Why do you eat?" Eat my arm round the plate in case somebody's going to take it away from me.
And I always remember watching him eat, and I was just like, "How can you eat that quickly?" And he was like, "Oh, we were in when we were standing, in the mountains, you had to eat your food then. Otherwise, you might not get another chance to eat it." Yeah. So I don't know. There was something really warm about the Nicaraguans. The country is quite. I'd say it's the country with the least infrastructure where I've lived. They've not got very many sort of paved roads, and it's not very built up. I mean, Myanmar is much more built up and developed.
Really, that's surprising.
Yeah, than Nicaragua. I mean, Nicaragua is a very small country. Its main income is from coffee or tourism.
Okay.
So the sort of national.
Was there any infrastructure there to start with it before the long war? and it got destroyed, or was it just never there to start
There
with?
was sort of colonial infrastructure that was destroyed in an earthquake in the
Okay.
1970s, I think, if I
Right.
remember correctly. So there was sort of a lot of buildings and things that got destroyed in Managua, which is the capital. But yeah, I guess I think there's just been the revolution, the war, and then just not
Yeah.
much chance to get things back on track. And then
Okay.
I mean, a lot of the national income is from coffee, and then there's a lot of corruption as well, and all of that just doesn't stem to building,
it's not
a lot
conducive,
more
yeah.
infrastructure. But within that, like, I think if you just look at the country sort of on face value, you maybe don't see a very lot. But once you get to know the stories of the people and the sort of history behind it, it becomes quite a fascinating place. So I think that's sort of what struck me most about Nicaragua. All these people. This guy, actually, if I can show you on my poster, he lived in a national park called Reserva de Tisay, which was quite near Esteli, where I lived.
Okay, I'll just take one and have a look.
Yeah, have a wee look. And so you can see he's showing us one of his pictures here, but he'd actually carved onto the rock face of this park this whole sculpture, which included elephants, women, I can't remember, was it Eiffel? No, I think it was the Empire State Building. He'd sort of carved all this into the mountains of this park. It was amazing. Potentially Vandal, but I mean, he created this whole enormous rock face. He must have spent years just carving into this rock. So there's always people with stories like this, that were really interesting people. Yeah, so
Good stuff.
Yeah, that's Nicaragua.
Have you got a Nicaragua-related poem for us?
Yeah, I think my favourite one is the one about my driver, who was the project driver in our project, and he was called Don Silvio. And he used to be a comandante in the Sandinista Revolutionary Army.
Okay.
And Don Silvio liked to give me advice, especially about dating.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so Don Silvio's dating advice was that you have a woman in each town you go through. And if one woman doesn't treat you well, then you go to the next town and you...
He sounds like he could be my guru. You got his phone number?
I was still in contact with him through other people.
Was he working
Was
on
that
you?
dating advice for you?
Well, I think that was for me as well. Like,
So
I think
you were meant to have a gentleman?
Yeah, well, he wasn't very. Yeah, he liked the idea of having
Options.
options. Yeah.
Was he trying to turn you into one of these options? Or do you,
I'm not entirely sure.
He didn't succeed, did
I think
he?
he enjoyed telling me about how to have options more than anything. He liked being this sort of fountain of knowledge. Yeah. No, he was great fun. I liked hanging out with Don Silvio a lot. Yeah, but anyway, he inspired this poem, but also because he was this very strong Sandinista and he loved the president Ortega.
Right.
He inspired a poem that sort of began linking all these different issues in Nicaragua together. Will I do that for you now?
I would love to
absolutely.
hear
Yeah.
it. Thank you.
Okay, here goes. Who wouldn't say yes to drive the president's Mercedes north from Managua? Yes. South from Managua? Yes. A smooth drive. If you didn't snore in the back seat, might seem yours, this Mercedes. Maybe yes. Maybe no. You have seen this whole country, the rough back roads, the stretch of new carretera. In each new town, you have a different mujer. Exotic or plain, gorda or guapa. She offers you her local ways. Yes. In Jinotega, she is hollow, a black clay jug. In Tipitapa, she bites for a ride. Dámelo. In Matagalpa, she is painted like a bow, her mouth shaped like a no. Cuando estaremos solos? When will we be alone? She wants to know. In San Juan, she sits like a hammered nail. You pour your own coffee, roll your own tortilla, and wait for her to ask in her hard voice, ¿Y este presidente? All of them ask for the future, thinking yes and knowing no. And you say yes and no, meaning no. At the side of the road, the poor women cry, when will we live? and you think now, pressing too hard on your pedal? Maybe yes, maybe no. Mostly, it is waiting by your own door, the street going past 3 times, maybe 4, the kitchen going hot and cold. Your wife, half turned, half folded, your child, half wasted, half promised. If you were asked, what way would you have it? You would laugh, like it is a game. Quien sabe, verdad? Who knows, right? You would say. Another empty bottle, another real woman. I was in revolution. If God wants, I live. Yes. No. Then his call, the tossed keys are ready in your hand, a low laugh. Yes, to everything. No, to everything else. And then, mi amor, I go.
Complete with authentic Nicaraguan.
There we go,
Spanish
Nicaraguan Spanish.
Superb.
I can't help but get the Nicaraguan Spanish.
It's wonderful. So I think finally you'll have to take us to Egypt.
To Egypt, yeah, let's visit Egypt. So I lived in Egypt about a year after the famous revolution.
Okay, the what did we call it again?
The spring.
The spring, the Arab Spring.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, Arab
Turned
Spring's
into
obviously a bit
winter of
wider than just
discontent,
Egypt. Yeah, but yeah, after the Tahrir uprising and at that time there was still a lot happening in Egypt. They hadn't had the elections yet to elect their president, so it was still a lot of, I suppose, unrest at that time. But also, I found it to be a bit like, you know how you imagine Montmartre during the 19th century? Like sort of lots of artists and bohemians and people believing that everyone working together could change the world, and feel this sense of people power was really, really strong in Egypt.
Wow, and was that quite inspiring for you as well?
Absolutely, I found it such an inspiring place to live. Yeah, it was a great place to be. Yeah, it was really interesting. There was always
and
like
feeling you're part of history and something happening.
Yeah, I mean there was a lot happening. There was people painting murals on walls, and there was like free art and free films, and people, you know, wanting. I was doing a lot of journalism at that time, so I interviewed a man who wanted to plant the whole of Cairo with trees.
Wow.
You know, Cairo desert, but he wanted to, you know, plant trees across Cairo. And
it's a good plan.
And what were you writing about when you were doing the journalism?
A lot of human rights.
Right.
I did a lot of human rights coverage of what was happening in Egypt at that time.
Yeah.
So trying to look at sort of things like freedom of expression during the revolution, women's issues, a lot of sort of women's representation and changes that were happening in Egypt, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Great.
So yeah, no, it was really interesting time to be there, and I don't know, I think activists are really interesting people to be around as well, because in some ways they're so, I don't know, they're so optimistic about things, but at the same time, often you see them as being people who are fighting, but actually really and often they've got really beautiful ideals as well that they're fighting for. And it's a nice, I don't know, it's a really interesting conversation to listen in on or somehow be a part of. Yeah.
And what was the progression of your stay there?
What do you mean?
What was the situation on the ground when you came? What were you there to help with, and what did you see change over the course of your time?
Okay, so when I was there I wasn't in Egypt too long. I was in Egypt about a year, just under a year. So I suppose when I first went there, it was about a year after the revolution, almost exactly to the day. So there were quite a lot of protests and unrest around that time. I don't think that really necessarily changed. I think Egypt, I think the way that activism has evolved in Egypt, that people see the value of going out in the streets, so that sort of practice remains. Although now obviously it's been clamped down a lot because of the new military government. That's not so possible now. But at that time and up until the military came back into power, that was sort of became quite common in Egypt. People would go out into the streets to protest about things. When I left after Morsi was elected, so I was sort of witnessing the whole election unfold, and then when Morsi, not long after Morsi was elected, I left, and I left because I suppose what I was working on in Egypt was a lot of sort of short-term contracts and short-term work, and it was just a country that for personal reasons I really wanted to go and live in. Not so much to do with the revolution, though it was so great to be part of the revolution. It was a place that I felt I'd read a lot about, I'd been involved in a lot in various aspects of my life, and I just wanted to go and live there for a while. So I worked on a lot of short-term contracts, but then I got offered the longer-term job in Myanmar, so that's what I decided to leave and go and do something more long term. Yeah, but I still
not because you were finished in Egypt, because you liked Egypt, but because it was a big opportunity.
It was a big opportunity to go and work in Asia, and I was also focusing on land rights, which I was so interested in. So I really wanted to go and do the job in Myanmar. But I still got a huge affection for the Middle East. I'd love to go back to Egypt.
What's the land rights situation in Egypt? How does it? I mean,
it's to be honest, it's not something I've studied a great deal, so I won't go into a lot of detail on that. But I did look into women's land rights there quite a bit, and it's similar to a lot of what we talked about before. Yeah, the sort of same sort of being prohibited through customary practices to access or to have ownership, I suppose, of land. Yeah, so it's similar. But yeah, I suppose Egypt for me is sort of marked by this huge revolutionary period and what was happening then, and that was what I suppose was most fascinating at that time. This change and all the different voices within that change and how they came about. And a lot of people were saying the revolution in Egypt's not over. Right. It's just going through a short sort of phase, which involves unfortunately a lot of military crackdown and police presence, and that it will go into another phase where people will come back again. But I'm not sure entirely what form that will take.
It was the president, was it Mubarak that was the president before?
Yeah, he was the president originally.
Where I don't hear much of what happened. I know he was in the jail and they put him on trial and they convicted him of something.
He was convicted and then actually I have to check that out. I'm not sure what happened after that.
There's not much.
He was convicted when I was there actually, and then I'm not sure. I didn't follow that story afterwards. Yeah,
no, exactly.
Yeah, too much other stuff was happening. There were new presidents.
One for amnesty there.
Find out after we're back. Yeah.
So perhaps you'll recite to us one last poem.
Something from Egypt.
And give us the background to that.
There's no belly dancing if you do.
No belly dancing. This is actually a Sufi dancer here.
All right, cool.
So yeah, no belly dancing. He's a guy swirling Sufi dancer on that poster. Yeah. Let me think. What will I give you from Egypt? So in Egypt we've got some gender equality poems, and we've got a poem about the Egyptian language, the way they use one word in Arabic that kind of fascinates me, and then a poem about, I suppose, a little bit about the revolution, little snapshots from the revolution.
Your choice, Mr. Sammeroff.
The one about the language really appeals. They all sound great, and if you want to see the rest, the rest of them, you'll know to find Catriona's show at Opium Bar on Cowgate, and you better catch it before the 16th of August, otherwise you will miss it. So please give us one last poem.
So do you want the one about language?
Yeah, that sounds fascinating.
Okay, so the one about language is about this word khalas.
Okay. Again, sorry?
Khalas.
Like a gesundheit. Okay.
Yeah, it's like starts with like loch, like loch and stuff. It starts with that, which is quite hard actually to do when you're used to being at the end of a sentence. So loch, so khalas. And that word means in Arabic it means a bit like whatever, like it's done, it's finished, I don't care, it's over.
Right.
It's very much a sort of cathartic release of, I like it much more than the English word because it's much more cathartic, it's much more of a release.
Yeah.
So
it's better than meh as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I liked a lot the way the Egyptians spoke. They're very funny people. They made a lot of jokes and a lot of sort of witty things. But this for me was particularly amusing, just the way they used this word. And so I wrote a poem based on it. Yeah.
Let's have you.
Cool. Moscow came over the Nile today, like a new sort of winter, breathing truth down hot necks. I would have called you, he says. And he would have, but he didn't. And so khalas. Here God is remembered. He's there in the road, in the shivering river, and in the wild air of African winter. I would have come with you, she says. And she means it, but she didn't. And so khalas. So onwards, through the southern bends of the city, to the round cracked toes of women who are whole in their whole lives, where they bloom like flowers, crack like thumbs, and lick their tongues, sweet as dates, over their words. You would have come before, she whispers. And you would have, but you didn't. And so khalas.
Really? So not only the first woman in the Scottish Liberty podcast, but the first poet as well.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Oh, that's
they're
fun.
breaking all the rules.
Oh, there you go.
So, is there anything you'd like to express before we wrap up for today?
No, I think, yeah, I mean, obviously you've only got a few days left to see it, but if you've got time, come with the rest of the journey. We visit 3 continents in 1 hour. We gather a lot of air miles. And yeah, it's been a nice way for me to share some of my experiences back home in Scotland, of all these different places I've lived and worked. So yeah, I'd love to see you all
Thanks
there.
for sharing it with us.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you for sharing your poems, your experiences, and also the knowledge. And it's been very educational as well as really just enjoyable to sit down and have a chat and laugh with you. So thanks very much for coming on the Scottish Liberty podcast, and hopefully look forward to getting up to your show.
Thanks for having me, guys.
You're welcome.
Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.